Throughout the years, video games have caused tons of controversy. Mortal Kombat's excessive violence and gore helped to establish the ESRB rating system. Grand Theft Auto has had and continues to have countless issues from political figures and parents due to everything those games are about. More recent issues we face today are games being released unfinished and buggy like Cyberpunk 2077 and Redfall. Then there's The Last of Us Part 2. It's brutal with gore and violence, it has nudity and sexual scenes, there aren't any major game-breaking bugs or issues to the game itself. In fact, the game is extremely well crafted. But The Last of Us Part 2 has to be the most controversial game of all time, at least in recent memory. As we all know, The Last of Us is regarded as one of the best video games of all time. It ended the PlayStation 3's generation on a high. The game has had a remaster and a remake. It's been adapted into a hit television series on HBO. It's one of those games everyone has either played or at least knows about. People completely fell in love with The Last of Us. The emotional growth and journey of Joel and Ellie from strangers to this father-daughter dynamic relationship pulled at everyone's heartstrings. And in those final moments of The Last of Us, it left us all wondering where the game would go next, and more importantly, when the next game would come. That sequel would take 7 years to come out. Naughty Dog teased us endlessly with snippets and footage of unknown characters and situations we would soon become familiar with, even some that were never in the game. The Last of Us Part 2 became one of the most anticipated sequels. Then the worst would come. 2020 was bad for too many reasons. Because of the pandemic, many were forced to work from home. The same happened for many developers, including Naughty Dog. Thankfully, they were still able to get the game out despite some delays. Though, not without issue. In late April, because everyone was working from home and had to use the cloud for work, many leaks happened. Plot details, videos showing cutscenes and gameplay, the game was spoiled months ahead of release. And like anything on the internet, news spreads, people talk, and it wasn't pretty. Mix this with the game's advertising, where trailers would replace another character with Joel, creating the illusion he was fully featured in the game. Even if you didn't know the leaks, Joel was still barely featured, raising some important questions about his fate. This is the game that completely divided the fanbase. Despite critical acclaim, the love for the original, all of this can be pinpointed to one scene in particular, the death of Joel. There was always going to be some kind of fallout from Joel's choice at the end of The Last of Us. Whether that would have been from Ellie or worse, Joel was never going to get away with his actions. Ellie was hope for humanity's future. There was the possibility that she could have saved the world with a cure, but for that to happen, she would have died. For Joel, he built up this relationship with her, filling in the void left from the death of his daughter. To us, Joel killing the doctor probably doesn't mean much because it's an NPC, a character we will all forget about later because he's not important. When it's revealed to be Abby's father, it shows us that every action has a reaction. This character had a life, he had a family, he had a purpose. We are so used to going to a game, shooting and killing enemies and moving on. But The Last of Us Part 2 changes this. The characters we fight against, the characters we could care less about, suddenly they're human. They have names, their allies react to their deaths, they react to the actions Ellie and Abby take. Sure, we will still take them out, but they're not brainless anymore. Naughty Dog did a ballsy and risky move by killing Joel. It was unexpected and gruesome. It's the catalyst for what's to come. His death was always going to cause some kind of reaction out of the player. Grief, sadness, anger, frustration. We thought we would have more time with Joel, more adventures with him and Ellie, and while we did see pieces of this, it doesn't change the fact that Joel is gone. Joel's death did have some kind of build-up to it, but the way it happened completely catches you off guard. Like many of the other shocking deaths in The Last of Us Part 2, one minute you know a character and the next, they're dead and you have to move on. It happens all too often. It shows us death can happen in an instant to the ones we love. These events lead Ellie down a dark and dangerous path. Ellie wants to get justice for Joel. Despite his actions resulting in their broken relationship, Joel was everything to Ellie. There's guilt she didn't have much time with him because of her anger towards him, especially when they were planning on starting over and didn't get that chance. In deciding to do this, Ellie devotes everything to this mission. The further she goes, the more it consumes her, and becomes reminiscent to Joel and his actions in The Last of Us, all while dragging her loved ones down with her. People die by her hand, a lot of these deaths completely unneeded, and it gets worse the further she goes. Ellie is no stranger to killing. When she did it in the first Last of Us, it really messed her up. It opened her up to the idea of killing another human, but there was still some kind of shock she had to process through at a young age. As Ellie hunts down Abby's allies for information, each kill gets worse, pushing Ellie past her limits into a territory she probably never assumed she would go into. For a number of her victims, she could have easily let them live, or not have been as gruesome and excessive in their deaths. Even when Ellie's told to walk away, she refuses. When given the chance to leave everything in the past and find her happiness with Dina, Ellie is too traumatized. She can't move on. How far is too far in the act of revenge? It's an endless cycle until someone walks away. They always say when going down the path of revenge, dig 2 graves. And Ellie's downfall is the perfect example of this. She gives up who she is in this pursuit, and by the end of the game, she loses everything. But before things heat up between Ellie and Abby, the story reverts back to Abby's perspective. It's like Heavy Rain or Resident Evil 6. Multiple characters, each campaign's storyline mostly stands on its own, but you need to play the whole game to understand the entire story. Because of the leaks, Abby was automatically hated. Even today, there is still hate. Because she is more muscular than the average woman, too many said she was transgender, despite this not being the case. Whereas Ellie's on a downward spiral, Abby's story is about change and personal growth. She's not just Joel's killer, she's not a villain. She's no different than any other character in The Last of Us. Really, you could say Ellie is the ultimate villain. Despite all this, Abby turned out to be a surprising character. Underneath all that brawn is someone who cares. Seattle is a battleground between 2 factions, the Washington Liberation Front, which Abby is a part of, and then the Seraphites, a religious kind of cult. Ellie gives us a taste of this endless war, but Abby gives us more in depth. Suddenly, Abby's world is turned upside down when she becomes entwined with 2 Seraphite outcasts. She turns her back on her own faction and she forms a bond with these 2 siblings. Even Lev himself had controversy. Because Lev is transgender, and being transgender means nothing to the Seraphites, they dead name him, and that was the issue. But that's how the world is. Not everyone is going to be respectful of Lev's transition, and because religion is a factor, being transgender will never be accepted. It's also a way to antagonize Lev because he is wanted by the group. By the end, Abby becomes a very likable character. The bond between her and Lev is irreplaceable. The game wants you to hate Abby at the start. In the end, it's Ellie you'll hate because of everything she's done. On the surface, The Last of Us Part 2 is a revenge story. I think we all know revenge is bad to an extent. Someone is always going to get hurt in some kind of way. Even the most angelic acts of justice result in someone getting in trouble. But in the world of The Last of Us, for these characters in this world, revenge is often the answer. Ultimately, this is a story about grief and how everyone handles grief differently. Abby had years to process the death of her father, so when she kills Joel, that anger returns when she finally faces him and she's able to move on. For Ellie, it isn't long after Joel's death that she chooses to go after Abby. She doesn't allow herself much or any time to grieve, instead pushing that aside to get her own kind of justice. Ellie doesn't confront her grief until it's too late, and it causes more damage than anything, fracturing her mental status and her relationships. The game is all about emotions. We feel the heartbreak and the anger of Joel's death, the desire to hunt Abby down, the happiness we share when Joel celebrates Ellie's birthday, the frustration and the change within these characters, even to the point where violence becomes too much, but we go through it anyway. Then the aftermath when we've gone too far, but we go further because there is still some kind of anger lingering. But if you got to know Abby, then you might feel differently. There's a whirlpool of emotions this game takes you through, and it's different for every single person. With that, many have said The Last of Us Part 2 is a bad game or one of the worst games of all time. People may disagree with its characters and its story choices, but when looking at the game itself, it's not even close to bad. It deserves the many awards it received. Naughty Dog pushed the boundaries of what they could do in a game. This is a sequel that greatly expands upon the foundation seen in the original and is all the better for it. Gameplay is familiar but changed enough to make it feel fresh. Levels allow for greater exploration. Players often have a choice between stealth or attacking head-on. Each area you explore is incredibly detailed. Naughty Dog went above and beyond with Seattle and how the characters interact with their world. So to call it a bad game, I think, is very misleading. If the leaks didn't happen, there still would have been controversy, but because everything was leaked ahead of time, it added fuel to the fire. People have their minds made up, and like anything shared online, hate spreads and it gets worse. People went into this game with extreme hatred and left with even more. What isn't right is for the actors, the developers, and so many others who put their blood, sweat, and tears into this project to get endless harassment and get sent death threats for doing their job. Like the face model for Abby, she still gets sent death threats for being the face of Joel's killer. We have the freedom to say whatever we want online, often without consequence. Many forget that so many actual real people with lives and feelings come together to make video games and to tell stories. People aren't going to like everything. Not all video games are for everyone. It's perfectly fine to have a different opinion. If you agree or disagree, as long as you're constructive about it, that feedback will go further. We all know The Last of Us Part 3 is inevitable. It'll be a long while till we see it, but The Last of Us is hotter than it has ever been thanks to its push by Sony and the successful HBO television show. Ellie's story isn't over, but Abby's part in it is. But that doesn't mean Abby has to be forgotten in the larger world of The Last of Us. We learned so much about Abby and Lev, their story about change and growth, the bond they formed. There's a lot invested. It would be a waste to not see more. There's a whole world The Last of Us can explore, and Abby is an excellent entry into this. The Last of Us Part 2 was a bold step for the series and a controversial one among players. It does something different, its choices aren't for everyone, but it's an extremely well-crafted game. Hate it or love it, people are still talking about The Last of Us Part 2. Let me know down in the comments, what are your thoughts on The Last of Us Part 2? Is it the most controversial game in recent memory? Be sure to like, share, and subscribe for future content. Check out my previous video on why I'm tired of The Last of Us after so many re-releases. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.